Marcus Hale thought his new teaching job in the small town of Blackwood would finally give him peace. But on the first morning, he noticed something strange about his students. They didn't write notes, they didn't whisper to each other, and they never broke eye contact with him. By the time Marcus found the notebooks hidden beneath their desks, filled with sketches of his own face, it was already too late. The first time I saw her, I thought she was just another teacher, nothing more, nothing less. She walked into the classroom with slow, measured steps, her shoes making no sound against the floor. She was tall, with skin so pale it seemed to glow faintly under the flickering fluorescent lights above. Her long black dress swayed like a curtain of shadows behind her, and when she stopped at the front of the room, her eyes swept over us. They weren't brown or blue or any color I had ever seen. They were gray, cloudy, empty, as though she had been carved from stone and given only the shape of a person, not the warmth of one. The longer she looked at us, the colder the room felt. Her smile was strange too. It stretched just enough to show she meant it, but it carried no kindness, no joy. It was hollow, like a mask. Something in me wanted to look away, but my eyes refused to leave her face. I felt caught in her gaze, like she had already chosen me for something I didn't understand. She didn't bring any books or papers like other teachers. Instead, she placed a single, old leather notebook on her desk. Its edges were frayed, the cover cracked and brittle, as if it had existed for centuries. When she opened it, I swear I saw something inside move just a flicker, like a shadow darting across the page. The air grew heavier, thicker, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. No one else reacted. No one else even seemed to notice. As the days went on, the classroom began to change. At first, it was small things. The light through the windows looked dimmer when she was there. The corners of the room seemed darker than they should have been, the air colder. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, but the feeling never left me. Every time I looked up from my desk, her eyes were already on me, watching, waiting. Her smile didn't fade. If anything, it deepened the longer I tried to avoid her stare. There was something unnatural about the way she moved. Her steps were too quiet, her hands too still, and she never seemed to blink. She just stared, as though blinking would mean missing something important. I found myself dreading the sound of the morning bell, knowing she would be there waiting, silent and strange, with that ancient leather notebook always resting in front of her. One afternoon, after class had ended, I dropped my notebook. It slid across the floor and stopped at her desk. I bent to pick it up, and that's when I noticed something carved into the wood beneath her chair. At first I thought it was graffiti, the kind students leave behind when they're bored, but these weren't names or doodles. They were deep scratches, jagged and uneven, curling into shapes I didn't recognize. They looked more like claw marks than anything a pen or knife could have made. I touched one with my fingertip, and the surface felt rough, torn apart as though whatever made them had dug deep into the wood. When I looked up, she was already standing. I hadn't heard her move. One moment she was seated at her desk, and the next she was directly in front of me, her face inches from mine. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my notebook again, but she didn't reach for me. She only tilted her head, her eyes wide and endless, and leaned close enough that I could feel the cold of her breath against my skin. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, just the faintest hiss, like the rustling of dry leaves. I ran out of the classroom that day without looking back. My chest burned, my hands shook, and for the first time in years, I felt like a terrified child again. I didn't know what she had tried to say, and I didn't want to know. But when I got home that night and opened my notebook, I realized she hadn't needed to speak at all. On the last page, written in neat, thin handwriting that wasn't mine, were words I couldn't understand. They looked like symbols, curling and sharp, drawn with perfect precision. And at the very bottom, written in ink so dark it seemed to sink into the paper itself, was my name. I couldn't stop staring at the page with my name on it. The symbols above it didn't belong to me, yet I felt them crawling in my head like insects, digging deeper the longer I looked. That night, every time I closed my eyes, I saw them burned into the dark, twisting like veins of fire. I told myself I would throw the notebook away, but when morning came, I found it resting neatly on my desk, even though I remembered leaving it inside my bag. I hadn't touched it. Somehow it had moved on its own. When I arrived at school, the air in the classroom was colder than the hallway. It was always colder when she was there. She didn't speak much that morning. She only opened her cracked leather notebook and began drawing lines on the chalkboard. They weren't letters, not numbers either. They were shapes loops, sharp angles, jagged strokes that twisted together like broken spider webs. She gestured for us to copy them. I hesitated, gripping my pencil, but when I glanced around, every student was already scribbling, their hands moving with unnatural speed. Their faces were blank, expressionless, as if the act of writing had emptied them. I told myself I wouldn't do it, that I'd just sit quietly and wait for the bell. But then I noticed her eyes on me. They didn't blink, they didn't shift. They bored into me until my arm moved against my will, dragging the pencil across the page. At first, my writing looked clumsy, uneven, but the longer I copied the symbols, the smoother they became. My hand stopped obeying me, moving faster, filling the paper with lines that seemed to grow heavier, darker, more alive. Sweat ran down my face, my hand cramping with pain, but I couldn't stop. It felt like the pencil was an extension of something that wasn't me, pulling me deeper with every mark. When the bell rang, I shoved the paper into my bag without looking at it. My hand throbbed as though I had carved the symbols into my own skin. I wanted to throw the paper away, but something inside me whispered that I should keep it. That whisper wasn't mine. At lunch, I finally opened my bag to tear it up. But the page wasn't what I remembered. The symbols were gone. In their place was a drawing. It was me sitting at my desk, head bent, pencil in hand. The detail was sharp, exact, like a photograph. The tilt of my shoulders, the wrinkle in my sleeve, even the smudge of ink on my wrist, it was all there. My breath caught in my throat. No one could have drawn me like that, not in the time we had. I shoved it deep into my bag and told myself to forget it, but when I got home, I found another drawing waiting for me. This one wasn't inside the notebook, it was on my pillow, the same paper, the same sharp lines. This time it showed me standing in the doorway of my bedroom, staring at my own bed. I froze, my skin prickled as the air turned icy though the window was shut. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like someone was hiding in the shadows, watching. My chest tightened as I scanned the corners of the room, every instinct in me screaming to run, but there was no one there, only the drawing. That night, I barely slept. When I did, I dreamt of her. She stood at the foot of my bed, her gray eyes glowing faintly, her notebook clutched in her hands. The pages fluttered open on their own, and drawings spilled out, covering the floor, the walls, even the ceiling. Each one was of me, caught in different moments, walking home, brushing my teeth, sitting at my desk, lying in bed. In every drawing, her figure lingered somewhere in the background, faint but present, always watching. I woke with a start, gasping, drenched in sweat. The dream had felt too real. My heart slowed only when I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But when I looked at my nightstand, the notebook was there, even though I hadn't brought it home that day. I reached for it with shaking hands, flipping to the last page. There was a new drawing. It showed me sleeping in my bed. The detail was sharper than any before, right down to the way my blanket twisted around my legs. But there was something different this time. My eyes in the drawing were open, wide, blank, staring directly at the ceiling, as if I had been awake the entire time. And just beneath it, in handwriting so small I almost missed it, were two words that made my blood run cold. I see. I tried to tell myself the drawings weren't real, that they were just tricks of my imagination, but the more I tried to believe that, the harder it became. Every morning when I walked into the classroom, I felt the air close in around me, pressing heavy against my skin. The windows looked darker than the rest of the school, like they were covered in a thin layer of ash, and the scratches beneath her chair had spread farther across the floor. They crawled outward like roots, curling in jagged directions, inching closer to the desks where we sat. I never saw her carve them, but each day they seemed deeper, as if something alive was trying to claw its way up from underneath. The other students didn't seem to notice. Their faces grew duller by the day, their eyes unfocused, as if the act of copying those symbols was draining them of who they were. I kept waiting for someone to speak up, to say anything about how wrong it all felt, but nobody ever did. They just obeyed her silently, their pencils scraping in unison, their movements stiff and unnatural. It was like sitting in a room full of mannequins. Then one morning a desk was empty. A boy who usually sat in the second row, someone I didn't know well but saw every day, was just gone. His seat was perfectly clean, the surface bare, as though he had never existed. I scanned the room, waiting for someone else to notice, but no one reacted. When she called out the names on the attendance sheet, his wasn't there. It was as if he had been erased. My stomach twisted, but I kept silent, afraid that if I drew attention to myself, she would look at me longer than she already did. That night, I dreamt of him. He sat slumped at his desk, his skin pale and waxy, his lips sewn shut with thick black thread. His eyes darted toward me, wide with terror. Pleading for help, he couldn't speak. Behind him she stood with her hands on his shoulders, her nails long and sharp, pressing so hard they broke the skin. Thin lines of blood ran down his arms, soaking into the scratches on the desk. She smiled at me then, her gray eyes glowing faintly, and I woke up choking on my own breath. The next day, when I opened my notebook, there was a new drawing. It wasn't of me this time. It was of him, the missing boy. The sketch showed him sitting at his desk exactly as he had in my dream, lips sewn shut, blood dripping from his arms. My stomach dropped when I saw the words scrawled beneath the image in jagged, uneven ink. Next I wanted to scream. But instead I shoved the notebook back into my bag and sat frozen through the day, my chest tight with fear. Every sound made me flinch, every flicker of the light above made me jump. I kept telling myself I'd throw the notebook away, but when the final bell rang, I couldn't bring myself to do it. My hands trembled as I held it, like letting go of it might be worse than keeping it. That night, the whispers started. At first it was faint, almost like wind slipping through the cracks in my window. But as the hours passed, the voice grew clearer. It wasn't a language I understood, but I knew it was her. The whispers came from my notebook, vibrating against my desk like something alive was trapped inside. I pushed it into my closet, shoved blankets over it, but still the whispers seeped through, filling the room until I covered my ears and curled beneath my blanket like a child. When I finally drifted into sleep, I saw her again. She was closer this time, standing at the side of my bed. Her notebook hung open in her hands, its pages fluttering, though there was no wind. The drawings weren't just of me anymore. They showed every student in the class, one by one, each with their mouths sewn shut, their eyes wide and lifeless. At the very back of the notebook was a blank page, and when she turned to it, I saw my face begin to form. The lines appeared one by one, slow and deliberate, until I was staring at myself, sketched in her gray, delicate strokes. I woke with a start, gasping, drenched in cold sweat. My closet door was open. The blankets I had used to bury the notebook were scattered on the floor. The book was lying on my pillow, open to that last page, my face half finished in black ink, waiting for her to complete it. And in the corner of the page, written so faintly I almost didn't see it, was a single chilling word. Soon I stopped bringing the notebook to class, but it didn't matter. No matter where I left it, no matter how far I tried to put it from me, it always returned. I left it buried in the trash can outside one morning, but by the time I sat down at my desk it was already waiting in front of me, perfectly centered on the wood. My classmates didn't seem to see it. They didn't see anything anymore. Their eyes looked dull, their movements mechanical, as though they were no longer people at all. When she entered, the room fell into that familiar silence, the kind that pressed on my chest until I could hardly breathe. The scratches that had once been confined to a chair had spread across the entire floor. They were no longer shallow marks. They were deep, gouged wounds in the wood, curling into shapes that looked more like symbols than random claw marks. Sometimes, if I stared too long, I thought I saw them shift, writhing slightly, as if something beneath the surface was alive and waiting. She opened her notebook, and we all obeyed without a word. My pencil moved against the paper, copying more of those terrible symbols. I told myself I would resist, that I would keep my page blank, but as soon as she looked at me, my hand betrayed me. It felt like I wasn't even inside my body anymore, like I had become just another tool for her to use. When the bell rang, I sat frozen, unable to breathe properly. That evening, when I got home, I discovered something far worse. The symbols we had drawn in class were now carved into my walls. They twisted across the paint in jagged lines, starting at the front door and weaving all the way into my bedroom. They pulsed faintly, as if the ink was alive beneath the surface, glowing and fading in rhythm with a heartbeat I could not hear. I backed out of my room, heart racing, but the moment I stepped into the hallway, the air grew colder. Something moved behind me, a sound like chalk dragging across a blackboard. My chest tightened. I turned slowly, and in the dimness of my room, I saw the faint outline of someone standing in the corner, too tall, too still. The figure did not move, did not breathe, but I knew it was her. When I blinked, she was gone. The room was empty again, but the smell of chalk dust hung heavy in the air. On my bed, a new drawing was waiting for me. This one wasn't like the others. It showed the inside of my house. Every detail perfectly captured the narrow hallway, the cracked floor tiles, the door to my room, and in the very center of the drawing, a figure stood exactly where I had just seen her. My hands shook as I shoved the page into the drawer of my desk, but the damage was done. That night, I didn't dare sleep. Every creak of the house felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The whispers came again, louder this time, seeping from the notebook I had hidden. They filled my ears until I couldn't tell whether the voice was inside my head or pressing against the walls of the room. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion won. I woke with a start to the sound of scratching, sharp and deliberate, coming from just beyond my bedroom door. I lay frozen, my heart hammering, listening to the noise grow closer, higher, until it sounded like it was right against the wood. With every scrape, flakes of paint fell from the door onto the carpet. Summoning courage I didn't have, I pulled the blanket tighter around me and whispered to myself that it wasn't real. But when the sound stopped, I couldn't bring myself to move. Minutes passed in suffocating silence until I finally forced myself to get up. The hallway was empty, but my door was no longer plain. Carved into its surface were the same symbols we had been forced to copy, etched deep into the wood as though burned in. My fingers brushed over them, and they were warm to the touch, pulsing faintly beneath my skin. When I stumbled back into my room, the notebook was waiting for me on my bed again, open to a new drawing. This time it showed my bedroom exactly as it was in that moment, the messy floor, the carved door, the crumpled blanket. And in the drawing I wasn't alone. I stared at it in silence, my blood turning to ice. Behind the figure of me lying in bed, there was another figure drawn in the shadows of the room. Her figure, her eyes, watching me from the corner where I had seen her before. I looked up quickly, heart hammering in my chest. The corner of my room was empty, nothing but darkness. But when I looked back at the drawing, her hand was resting on my shoulder. By the time the last week of school arrived, the classroom no longer felt like a place for learning. It was something else. Something alive, breathing and waiting. The walls were no longer clean. They were covered in black stains, smudges, and symbols. drawn so many times that the paint beneath had begun to peel. The ceiling sagged with dark patches, and the floor looked rotten, clawed open in spirals that dug deeper each day. It felt like the room itself was collapsing into another place, and she was at the center of it all. Only a handful of students remained. The rows of empty desks grew longer each morning, and I realized that I was one of the last. I could barely remember the names or faces of those who had vanished. It was like they had been erased not just from the room but from my memory, wiped out as though they had never been alive. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I thought I saw them, pale, stitched figures, standing just beyond the edge of my vision, watching silently, waiting for me to join them. She never spoke. She didn't need to. Her notebook did everything for her. When she opened it that morning, I forced myself not to look. I kept my head down, my hands clenched in fists, my nails digging into my palms, but I could feel her gaze burning through me. A pressure built behind my eyes, pulling my head upward against my will. The notebook lay open on her desk. This time, she wasn't hiding the pages. I saw them clearly for the first time. They weren't paper, they weren't even drawings. The pages were pale and stretched thin, stitched together like a patchwork of skin. On them were names burned into the surface, glowing faintly with a sickly light. I recognized some of the names. They belonged to the students who had disappeared. My stomach lurched as I realized each page belonged to someone who had once sat in this classroom. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. My legs trembled, my throat locked tight. She turned one page, then another, each one showing a new face, a new life, captured and trapped. When she stopped, her gray eyes lifted and found mine. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out with one long hand and turned to a blank page. My chest tightened as I realized what it meant. That page was mine. That night, the notebook followed me home again. I didn't fight it anymore. I placed it on my desk and sat in front of it, staring at the blank page that seemed to wait for me. I didn't know if it was better to ignore it or to see what she wanted me to see. My hand moved toward it before I could stop myself. The page rippled under my fingertips like water. For a moment, I felt as though I had fallen into it, drowning in the weight of her endless gaze. When I pulled my hand back, there was ink on my skin, symbols curling across my palm like veins. No matter how hard I scrubbed, they wouldn't come off. They burned hotter the longer I looked, pulsing like a heartbeat. I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made me flinch. Every shadow seemed too solid, too deliberate. Sometime after midnight, I heard a faint scratching again, the same sound that had haunted me before. It came from the corner of my room. My heart pounded as I turned toward it. She was there. Not a dream, not a shadow. She was standing in the darkness of my room, her face pale, her eyes gray, her mouth stretched in that hollow smile. The notebook hung open in her hands, its pages glowing faintly, and the drawings spilled out of it one by one, floating into the air, surrounding me. They circled the room like vultures, every one of them a sketch of me in some different moment. Sitting at my desk, walking home, sleeping in bed. But one drawing made me freeze. It showed me sitting exactly as I was now, hunched on the floor, staring at her. My body trembled as I reached for the notebook, desperate to tear it apart, to end this. But when I touched it, the pages flipped violently, faster than my eyes could follow. They stopped on a drawing that made my stomach twist into knots. It wasn't me anymore. It wasn't anyone from the class. It was the inside of this very room, my desk, my bed, my walls. And there, in the shadows behind me, a figure was drawn with perfect detail. Slowly, I turned my head. The corner of the room was empty. But when I looked back at the page, the figure had moved closer. I shut the notebook and shoved it under my bed. But I knew it didn't matter. The drawings weren't inside the book anymore. They were inside me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the unfinished sketch of my own face, waiting for her to complete it. And sometimes, when I glance at the mirror, I think I see her standing behind me, gray eyes staring, pencil in hand, already finishing the lines.